station, where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
The Voynich Manuscript is a fascinating example of an unsolved mystery. It's a topic that came to my attention quite recently as a result of listening to an old Terence Mckenna recording from the 80s, which is now surfaced on the internet. It's on YouTube and available all over the place. Now, for those that aren't familiar with Terence Mckenna's work, he was a psychedelic researcher. Some describe him as a sort of pioneer of the psychedelic movement, along with the likes of Timothy Leary, and he was around in the 80s and 90s. He was certainly active then, most active. And McKenna kind of had a sort of polymath approach to various topics. He really was very knowledgeable in a multitude of areas, not just ethnobotany and all these specific psychedelic subjects. And in this talk Terence McKenna gave in the 80s, he provided what many describe as the best account of the Voynich Manuscript, what it is and why it's such a fascinating subject. I haven't really come across anyone else talking about it in the level and in the detail and in the passionate way that McKenna would often provide. So, for those that aren't familiar then, what is the Voynich Manuscript? Well, it's a historical text, a sort of mysterious book which entered into the collection of one Wilfred Voynich in 1912, and he was a regular sort of New York rare book collector in the sort of traditional classic sense, if you like. And he came across this book, and it wasn't named, and for a start, I mean, that's why it is called the Voynich Manuscript. It's because that's the best name that people have for this book. It's because it came to this collector's attention, and ever since it's been known as the Voynich Manuscript. But you can study this book. I mean, the PDF's available online. It's been carefully recreated as a electronic file. But this book now exists in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, and it's classed simply as a ciphertext. That's the description that they provide. And all I suspect they think of the document is that it is basically a document that's written in code that is completely mysterious, completely baffling. And the reason this document is such a fascinating topic is because, unlike with many historical documents that have some sort of code, some sort of cipher applied to them, this one just hasn't been cracked. Nobody can determine its origin, what it represents, what it's meant to talk about, what even the subject is half the time. It's just an utterly baffling, mysterious book that it has an almost alien-like sort of energy about it. It's hard to explain. And like I say, if you do want to check this book out, just Google the name Voynich Manuscript and you'll get the PDF and you can have a look for yourself. And it's a document that's a mixture of text and bizarre abstract illustrations of figures and of plants and of really kind of eerie concepts like naked women sort of coming out of tubes, and sort of a kind of hybrid mixture of pipework and human beings. Very, very bizarre, and unlike anything that anyone really has seen in other books. There's no other example of this sort of bizarre illustrations. Now, McKenna provided this fantastic talk, which I don't really want to just repeat as part of this episode. What I want to do is try and perhaps further it ever so slightly, because I think some information has come to light in the last year, which is interesting, and very few people picked up on it. One of the things that McKenna said about this book, he provided an extensive account of the history, and I mean, I think all we really need to know for the purposes of this episode is that the chief, perhaps the most sort of likely theory there is, or was, of this document's origin, was that it was sort of believed academically that the book originated from the 16th, 17th century, perhaps, and it very likely had something to do with the English occultist John Dee, who was around during that period. And John Dee was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He was an alchemist, an astronomer, a mathematician, a fascinating Gandalf-like figure who is well known in the occultist circles. And McKenna's theory was that John Dee wrote the Voynich Manuscript. It was his creation, and he had some help from various sort of providers of ciphers, because in those days there was no computer system that could generate cipher code. It was the work of absolute genius mathematicians. So people would, one of the things that sort of is known is that historically, if you want to break the code of an old rare book, usually the code is known because it was provided by a particular person who the researchers, the cryptologists, can name. So for that reason, that's why the Voynich Manuscript is so baffling. There's no other example of this code anywhere else. No other book, absolutely no other reference to it anywhere, or anything like it. That's what's so utterly inconceivable. And McKenna believed that John Dee wrote this, perhaps even as part of some sort of unique cipher that he devised. And perhaps within this document was some sort of ultimate truth. And this is McKenna's theory. This was the theory he personally liked, and it was the theory that seemed the most likely at the time, in the sort of late 80s. But that was 20 years ago, or well, 30 years ago now, and counting. So what's changed? What new information has come to light about the Voynich Manuscript? Well, the answer is not a lot. Now, historically, I mean, the Bletchley Park code breakers attempted to crack this book. The CIA have an actual acknowledged interest in the document, and they attempted to break the code and understand its meaning. The world's supercomputers have all been used to sort of try and work out some sense of this document. Absolutely nothing has come to light. No attempt has succeeded. There are some very fascinating accounts which McKenna went into about old academics suddenly announcing that they'd had the code, they knew what it was, and they announced this in their deathbed. And a sort of phone call was made to announce that they knew what was happening, what the code meant, but they could only explain it to somebody in person because they were too weak to talk on the phone. And then the researcher arrived at the house, and they died in the space between 2 or 3 hours of that phone call and the travel. All these sort of mysterious sort of accounts of this sort of thing going on. But all I would like to sort of make clear in this episode is that it really is one of those things that has not even remotely been broken or understood. Now, McKenna believed that John Dee put this together, and one of the fascinating things that McKenna said in his talk was that the actual likelihood of this being a John Dee document was quite high, quite strong. And McKenna believed that if it turned out to not be by John Dee, then the only possible explanation that he would have would be that it is some sort of alien document, some sort of bizarre text that came into the possession of these occultist characters at the time, that was talking about some otherworldly realm that literally was from another world. It was so alien in its origin and in its subject matter that it really was like a sort of document that was provided by an ET, by the UFO itself. And it's an interesting theory. But what has recently come to light in 2011 is that carbon dating has meant that they have now determined the age of the manuscript. And the interesting thing that came to light during that period was that actually the manuscript is 100 years or a century older than it was believed at first. And what's interesting about that is that means that it's older than John Dee. So John Dee was not born at the time. John Dee did not exist when this document has been carbon dated back till. So therefore McKenna's theory, arguably, if you're to believe carbon dating, was not correct. It was not John Dee. So for that reason, it adds a very interesting sort of spin to the manuscript story, which is that all through the 80s and 90s, I think it was general consensus that it must have been John Dee. Well, in 2011, that theory was utterly quashed by carbon dating, but nothing was really said. It wasn't a particularly big story at the time, and it really wasn't. There was no emphasis on it. Certainly wasn't in the news. I don't remember. I just dug it up as an old Google search and found various mainstream news. You know, some of it's mainstream, but it's not televised. It's sort of mainstream articles. Now, this suggests that this could well be something otherworldly in nature, because there is no other example of this cipher, this code. There are 250,000 characters, and they are all totally alien. There is no other example of them being used. And also the symbols, many of them don't even come close to any Latin or Roman character. So in other words, there's no comparable language. They are just utterly alien in nature. And that's why I think it's such a fascinating topic. Now, John Dee seemed like a likely sort of author. But if we are now saying that it wasn't John Dee, then based on all the research that I've done, there is no other theory that really stands any ground at all. They're as baffled by this today as they were 50 or 100 years ago. So I suggest that you should look at this book, because obviously it's a kind of bold statement to make, but I think we could be looking at some sort of truly alien artifacts here. And if we are to have any belief in this UFO subject or of extraterrestrial interaction with human affairs for the last few hundred years, or even going back even to sort of Sumerian times, then this may well be some actual physical piece of evidence of some sort of otherworldly knowledge base. And even the illustrations themselves are baffling, because from a sort of botanist's perspective, one of the things that was first sort of theorized was that this was some sort of botanist's guide to the wilderness, because there was an entire section devoted to plants. But what was said in the 80s and still holds ground today was that, well, actually none of these plants can be identified. That they're all just utterly abstract, alien, bizarre plants. Not one can be even remotely identified. So it could well be that we are actually looking at some sort of, perhaps even some channeled knowledge. Perhaps some ancient monk literally was channeling an alien entity and put pen to paper, so to speak, and that's what we now have. Who knows? It's a fascinating subject, and it needs to be stressed that this is not something that could have just been sort of hoaxed, if you like. It's not. It would require too much painstaking time and effort to create a document of this nature, because one of the things that the cryptologists that have looked at this have said is that it does follow structure. There is a definite discipline and structure to this code. It isn't just random. It is following some sort of system, i.e. characters being repeated at the right sort of at a kind of moment in a word or what is perceived to be a sentence in the same sort of pattern and flow. All this kind of peripheral analysis has been done on the text, and they do know that there is structure to it, but the actual meaning is still what baffles them. So that's certainly something that I am now beginning to suspect. I think this could well be an example of channeled alien information. But it's just a shame that Terence McKenna isn't here today to provide his take on the manuscript. Now, arguably, we know for sure that it wasn't John Dee. And for those that want more information about this, I suggest you look at the document and also check out the Terence McKenna talk, which is actually available on YouTube. It's probably the best way to find it now. Just Google it or YouTube search it directly. So it's a fascinating manuscript, and it's an utterly unsolved mystery, and it's one that I just don't think we hear enough about.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.